March 1945. In a small prisoner of war camp in rural Pennsylvania, something was happening that violated every military regulation, every rule of engagement, and every social convention of wartime America. A 24-year-old German woman, captured while serving with a Luftwaffe communications unit, was falling in love with her 26-year-old American guard. And he was falling in love with her. Their story would become one of the most controversial and tender romances to emerge from World War II, a love that had to survive not just the barriers of war, but the judgment of two entire nations. Before we reveal how their impossible love story unfolded, tell us where you are watching from in the comments below. Elsa Schneider arrived at Camp Reynolds in January 1945, part of a small group of German women prisoners transferred from a facility in New York. She was tall and slender, with dark blonde hair that she kept pinned back in a tight bun, and gray-blue eyes that seemed to carry the weight of everything she had seen during the war. Before her capture in France, she had worked as a radio operator for the Luftwaffe, intercepting Allied communications and relaying coded messages. She was good at her job, efficient and precise, qualities that had served her well in the military, but had not prepared her for the confusion of becoming a prisoner of war. The camp itself was small, housing fewer than 40 German prisoners, most of them women who had served in auxiliary roles. It sat on the outskirts of a farming community, surrounded by rolling hills that reminded Elsa painfully of the German countryside. The facility had been a dairy farm before the war, and some of the original buildings still stood, converted now into barracks and administrative offices. Corporal Thomas Mitchell was assigned to the day shift guard rotation in February. He was a farm boy from Wisconsin, broad-shouldered and quiet, with sandy brown hair and kind hazel eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He had been injured during the Battle of the Bulge, taking shrapnel to his left leg that left him with a permanent limp. The injury had ended his combat service, but not his military career. He was assigned to Camp Reynolds to finish out his service, a posting he initially viewed as boring and pointless. He wanted to be with his unit, with his brothers in arms. Instead, he was stuck guarding enemy prisoners in rural Pennsylvania, watching the war end from the sidelines. Their first interaction was completely unremarkable. Elsa was working in the camp garden, one of the work assignments given to prisoners to keep them occupied. Thomas walked past on his rounds, nodded politely, and continued on. She barely looked at him. He barely registered her presence. Two people whose lives were about to become irrevocably entangled, and neither had any idea. The second time they interacted, it was because of a book. The camp had a small library, mostly donated volumes from the local community. Elsa had discovered a collection of English language novels and was slowly working her way through them, using a worn German-English dictionary to look up words she did not know. She had loved reading before the war, and books had become her escape from the tedium and uncertainty of prison life. Thomas noticed her one afternoon sitting under a tree near the library, completely absorbed in a copy of Wuthering Heights. He had read the same book in high school, back when he still thought he might become a teacher instead of a farmer. The sight of an enemy prisoner reading English literature struck him as oddly touching, a reminder that the woman in the gray prison uniform was still a person with interests and passions beyond the war. He approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her. "Do you like it?" he asked, gesturing to the book. Elsa looked up, surprised. Her English was accented but clear. "It is very difficult," she said carefully. "The language is old, and the people, they are very passionate, very angry." Thomas smiled. "Yeah, that is kind of the point, I think. Everyone in that book is miserable because they cannot just talk to each other like normal people." Elsa considered this, then nodded slowly. "Yes, this is true. They make themselves suffer." She paused, then added quietly, "Like the war. We make ourselves suffer when we could choose differently." The comment hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Thomas did not know how to respond. He nodded awkwardly and continued his rounds, but the brief conversation stayed with him. There was something about the way she spoke, the sadness in her voice, that suggested depths he had not expected to find in an enemy prisoner. After that, they began to talk more often. Small conversations, nothing that violated regulations. He would ask her about the books she was reading. She would ask him about America, about Wisconsin, about what life was like before the war. The conversations were always brief, always proper, always conducted where other guards and prisoners could see them. But slowly, gradually, they began to look forward to these moments. Thomas found himself timing his rounds to coincide with her work shifts. Elsa found herself choosing work assignments that would put her in places where he might pass by. Neither acknowledged what was happening. Neither wanted to name the feeling that was growing between them, the awareness, the anticipation, the warmth that spread through their chests when they saw each other. The turning point came in April, during a late spring rainstorm. Elsa had been working in the garden when the weather turned suddenly violent. Thunder cracked overhead and rain poured down in sheets. She ran for cover toward the nearest building, but slipped in the mud and fell hard, twisting her ankle. Thomas saw her fall from his post near the fence. Without thinking, he ran to her, his injured leg protesting the sudden movement. He knelt beside her in the mud, rain soaking through his uniform. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently. Elsa was breathing hard, her face twisted in pain. "My ankle," she gasped. "I cannot stand." He did not hesitate. He put one arm under her knees and the other behind her back and lifted her carefully. She was lighter than he expected, or perhaps adrenaline made her feel lighter. He carried her through the rain to the medical building, ignoring the shocked stares of other guards and prisoners who saw them. The camp nurse, Lieutenant Patricia O'Brien, examined Elsa's ankle and declared it a bad sprain but not broken. She wrapped it tightly and told Elsa to stay off it for a few days. Then she looked at Thomas, who was standing in the corner dripping muddy water onto the floor, and raised an eyebrow. "That was quite the heroic rescue, Corporal," she said dryly. Thomas felt his face flush red. "She was injured, ma'am. I was just doing my duty." Lieutenant O'Brien smiled knowingly. "Of course you were." She turned to Elsa. "You will need to use crutches for a week or so. I will have them brought to your barracks." After Elsa was settled, Thomas walked back to his post, acutely aware that his actions would be noticed, would be talked about. He had not done anything wrong, not technically. A guard was supposed to help an injured prisoner. But the way he had run to her, the way he had carried her so carefully, the way his heart had pounded with fear when he saw her fall, those things went beyond duty. That night, lying in his bunk, Thomas forced himself to confront what was happening. He was developing feelings for a German prisoner, an enemy national, a woman whose country had killed millions, whose military had wounded him, whose side had started the most destructive war in human history. It was wrong. It was impossible. It was completely against regulations. But when he closed his eyes, he saw her face, the way she looked when she talked about books, the intelligence in her eyes, the sadness that seemed to shadow everything she did, the quiet dignity with which she carried herself despite the humiliation of captivity. He saw a person, not an enemy, and that was perhaps the most dangerous thing of all. Elsa was having similar thoughts in her barracks. She lay on her bunk, her ankle throbbing despite the painkillers the nurse had given her, and thought about the American corporal who had carried her through the rain. She thought about the panic in his eyes when he saw her fall, the gentleness with which he had lifted her, the way his voice had shaken when he asked if she was hurt. She had been prepared to hate Americans. She had been taught to see them as enemies, as invaders, as the reason Germany was losing the war. But Thomas Mitchell did not fit the propaganda image. He was kind. He was thoughtful. He treated her like a human being, not like a prisoner or a Nazi or a monster. And she found herself drawn to him in ways that terrified her. In the days that followed, while Elsa recovered from her injury, Thomas found excuses to check on her. He would bring her books from the library. He would ask the kitchen staff to save extra bread for her. Small gestures that could be explained as professional courtesy, but felt like something more. One afternoon, he brought her a letter that had arrived from Germany. Mail from home was rare and heavily censored, but the Red Cross facilitated correspondence between prisoners and their families when possible. Elsa took the letter with trembling hands, recognizing her mother's handwriting on the envelope. She read it slowly, her face growing paler with each line. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and sat in silence, staring at nothing. Thomas, who had been waiting nearby in case she needed him to translate anything, noticed the change in her demeanor. "Is everything all right?" he asked quietly. Elsa looked up at him, and he saw that her eyes were filled with tears she refused to let fall. "My father is dead," she said flatly, "killed in an Allied bombing raid in January. My mother has been writing to me for months, but the letters were lost or delayed. He has been dead for months, and I did not know." Thomas felt his heart clench. "I am so sorry," he said, knowing the words were inadequate. Elsa nodded stiffly. He was a good man. He did not support the Nazis. He just wanted to keep his family safe. And now he is dead because of this war, because of bombs dropped by planes like the ones you Americans fly. She looked at him with something like accusation in her eyes, but also confusion, as if she could not reconcile the man standing in front of her with the machines that had killed her father. Thomas did not know what to say. He could not apologize for the war. He could not defend the bombing campaigns that had devastated German cities. But he also could not walk away from her pain. He sat down on a nearby chair, maintaining a respectful distance but making it clear he was not leaving. "I am sorry for your loss," he said again. "I know that does not change anything. I know it does not bring him back. But I am sorry." They sat in silence for a long time. Other prisoners and guards moved around them, but Thomas stayed with Elsa until she finally stood up, squared her shoulders, and walked back to her barracks on her crutches. He watched her go, feeling helpless and conflicted, and aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. After that day, their conversations became deeper, more personal. They began to talk about the war honestly, about the things they had seen and done, about the guilt and confusion they both carried. Elsa told him about growing up in Berlin, about watching her city transform under Nazi rule, about the slow realization that her country had become something monstrous. She told him about joining the Luftwaffe auxiliary because she had no other options, because women were being conscripted, because refusing meant being labeled a traitor. Thomas told her about his small town in Wisconsin, about the dairy farm his family had owned for 3 generations, about the day Pearl Harbor was attacked, and how all the young men in town had lined up to enlist. He told her about the Battle of the Bulge, about seeing his friends die in the snow, about the piece of shrapnel that ended his combat service and probably saved his life. They were breaking all the rules about fraternization. They both knew it, but neither could stop. They needed these conversations, needed this connection with someone who understood the complexity of living through war, the moral ambiguity, the way violence had corrupted everyone it touched regardless of which side they fought on. By May, when news came that Germany had surrendered, Thomas and Elsa had fallen completely in love, though neither had said the words aloud. They had not touched beyond that moment in the rain when he carried her to the medical building. They had not kissed, had not held hands, had not done anything that could be called romantic by any conventional definition. But they loved each other with an intensity that both frightened and sustained them. The surrender brought both relief and new uncertainty. The war in Europe was over. The prisoners would eventually be repatriated to Germany. Elsa would be sent back to Berlin, to a city in ruins, to a country devastated and occupied. And Thomas would be discharged, sent back to Wisconsin, expected to resume his life as if the war had never happened. The thought of losing her was unbearable. Thomas lay awake at night trying to figure out a solution, a way they could be together. But every option seemed impossible. He could not go to Germany. She could not stay in America. Even if they could somehow overcome the practical obstacles, there was the social reality. She was German. He was American. The war had just ended. The hatred and anger were still raw. What would his family say? What would his community think? And yet, he could not imagine his life without her. She had become essential to him, the person who understood him better than anyone, the woman who had shown him that love could exist even in the midst of hatred, that humanity could survive even war. Elsa was facing the same impossible calculations. She loved Thomas with a fierceness that surprised her. He was the first good thing that had happened to her in years. He was kind and honest and saw her as a person, rather than as a German or a prisoner or an enemy. But she knew the obstacles they faced. She knew how impossible their situation was. One evening in late May, they found themselves alone in the library. It was after dinner, and most of the camp was gathered in the recreation hall listening to news broadcasts about the surrender. Thomas was supposed to be on patrol, but he had timed his rounds to bring him to the library when he knew Elsa would be there. She was reading again, always reading, using books as a way to escape the uncertainty of her future. He sat down across from her, and for a long moment they just looked at each other. All the things they had not said, all the feelings they had not acknowledged, hung in the air between them. "I am being discharged next month," Thomas said finally. "I am going home to Wisconsin." Elsa nodded slowly. "And I will be sent back to Germany." She paused, then added quietly, "I do not want to go back." Thomas leaned forward, his voice urgent and low. "Then do not go. Stay here. Stay in America." Elsa smiled sadly. "It is not that simple, Thomas. I am a prisoner of war. I cannot just stay." "There are programs," he insisted. "I have been asking around. Displaced persons, immigration. There are ways for people to come to America after the war." "And what would I do here?" Elsa asked. "I have no family, no money, no skills that Americans want. And even if I could find a way to stay, what would people say?" "I am German, Thomas. The enemy. Your enemy." "You are not my enemy," he said fiercely. "You have never been my enemy." "But I was," she replied. "I worked for the Luftwaffe. I helped Germany fight against America. That is who I am. That is what I did." "That is what you were forced to do," Thomas countered. "That is not who you are. I know who you are, Elsa. I know you." They stared at each other across the small table, both breathing hard, both aware that this conversation was heading somewhere dangerous, somewhere irrevocable. "What are we doing?" Elsa whispered. "This is impossible. We cannot be together." "Why not?" Thomas demanded. "Because I am a prisoner, and you are a guard. Because we are from different countries that just spent years trying to kill each other. Because your family will hate me, and my family would be ashamed of me. Because it is against all the rules and all the expectations and everything that makes sense." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice broke. "Because I am falling in love with you, and I do not know what to do about it." Thomas felt his heart stop and restart. "I am in love with you too," he said. "I have been for months. And I do not care about the rules or what people think or any of it. I just care about you." They sat in the charged silence that followed these admissions, both aware that speaking the words aloud had changed everything. Finally, Elsa stood up and walked around the table. She stopped in front of Thomas, close enough that he could see the silver flecks in her gray-blue eyes, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of the lavender soap the prisoners were given. "If we do this," she said quietly, "if we try to make this work, it will be very difficult. People will judge us. They will say terrible things. Your family might reject you. My family might disown me. Is my love worth that to you?" Thomas reached out and took her hand, the first time he had deliberately touched her since he carried her through the rain. Her fingers were cold, and he wrapped both his hands around hers, trying to warm them. "You are worth everything to me," he said. "I do not care what anyone says. I want to spend the rest of my life with you if you will have me." Elsa felt tears finally spill down her cheeks, tears she had been holding back for months. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will have you." They could not kiss. Not there, not where anyone might see. But they stood holding hands, looking at each other with the stunned realization that they had just committed to something that most people would consider impossible, even treasonous. They had chosen love over loyalty, had chosen each other over their respective countries, had chosen hope over the hatred that the war had tried to instill in them. The path forward was not clear. Thomas spoke to Captain Reynolds, the camp commander, about sponsoring Elsa as a displaced person. The captain was sympathetic but warned him that it would be difficult, that immigration authorities would be suspicious, that the community might not accept a German woman so soon after the war ended. But Thomas was determined. He wrote to his parents in Wisconsin, explaining the situation as carefully as he could. The response was not encouraging. His father wrote back saying that while he trusted Thomas's judgment, bringing home a German woman would be difficult for the family to accept, that the community was still angry about the war, that perhaps Thomas should reconsider. His mother included a separate note at the bottom of the letter. "If you love her, bring her home. We will figure out the rest." It was not a ringing endorsement, but it was not a rejection either. It was enough to give Thomas hope. Elsa, meanwhile, wrote to her mother explaining about Thomas. The response took weeks to arrive, delayed by the chaos in post-war Germany. When the letter finally came, it was brief and to the point. "I have lost your father," her mother wrote. "I will not lose you too. If this American man loves you and treats you well, then go to him. Build a new life. There is nothing left for you here but ruins and memories. Be happy, my daughter. That is all I want for you now." The bureaucratic process was agonizingly slow. Elsa was officially repatriated to Germany in August 1945, sent back to Berlin with the other prisoners. But Thomas had filed the immigration paperwork before she left, listing himself as her sponsor. The separation was torture for both of them. They could only correspond through letters that took weeks to reach their destinations, never knowing if the next letter would arrive or be lost in the chaos of post-war mail systems. Elsa returned to a Berlin that was barely recognizable. Her childhood home had been destroyed in the bombing. Her mother was living in 2 rooms of a partially collapsed building, surviving on rations from the Allied occupation authorities. The city was divided into sectors controlled by different powers. The Soviet zone was particularly harsh, and rumors circulated about the treatment of German women by Soviet soldiers. Elsa moved in with her mother and tried to rebuild some semblance of a normal life while she waited for news about her immigration application. She found work as a translator for the American occupation authorities, using the English she had practiced with Thomas. The work was difficult, translating testimonies from war crimes trials, but it paid enough to help her mother survive. At night, she wrote long letters to Thomas telling him about the devastation she saw every day, about the guilt she felt for what Germany had done, about how much she missed him. He wrote back with stories about Wisconsin, about the farm, about slowly rebuilding his civilian life while waiting for her. Every letter ended the same way. "I love you. I am waiting for you. We will be together soon." The immigration process took 9 months. 9 months of paperwork and interviews and background checks. 9 months of uncertainty and waiting and hoping. Thomas called in every favor he had, contacted his congressman, wrote letters to the State Department. He was relentless, refusing to give up, refusing to accept that bureaucracy could defeat them after they had survived war. Finally, in May 1946, exactly 1 year after they had declared their love to each other in the camp library, Elsa received word that her immigration application had been approved. She could come to America. She could come to Thomas. The day she arrived at the train station in Milwaukee, Thomas was waiting on the platform, wearing his best suit, holding a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked that morning from the fields around his family farm. He saw her step off the train carrying a single battered suitcase that contained everything she owned in the world, and he started walking toward her, then running, his injured leg protesting but unable to stop him. Elsa saw him coming and dropped her suitcase. They met in the middle of the platform, and he swept her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she did not care. She held him just as tightly, both of them crying and laughing and overwhelmed by the sheer improbable reality that they were finally together, finally free, finally able to begin the life they had dreamed about during all those months of separation. "I love you," he said against her hair. "I love you so much." "I love you too," she replied. "I am here. I am really here." They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the Lutheran church in Thomas's hometown. His mother and father attended, though his father's smile was strained and his handshake with Elsa was stiff. His mother was warmer, embracing Elsa and whispering, "Welcome to the family, take care of my son." The community's reaction was mixed, as they had known it would be. Some people were supportive, impressed by the love story, moved by the idea of reconciliation between former enemies. Others were hostile, calling Elsa a Nazi and Thomas a traitor, refusing to do business with them, spreading cruel rumors. Thomas and Elsa endured it together. They bought a small house on the edge of town, far enough from the main street that they could have some privacy. Thomas returned to farming, working his family's land. Elsa helped him, learning the rhythms of dairy farming, the early mornings and hard physical labor that came with it. She also continued to work as a translator, corresponding with various organizations that needed German language expertise. Life was not easy. The hostility from some community members continued for years. There were threatening letters. There were acts of vandalism against their property. Once, someone painted Nazi across their barn door, and Thomas spent an entire day scrubbing it off while Elsa stood beside him, refusing to go inside, refusing to hide. But there were also moments of grace. Thomas's mother, who became Elsa's fiercest defender, invited them for Sunday dinner every week without fail, gradually breaking down her husband's resistance until he too accepted Elsa as his daughter-in-law. The local librarian, who remembered seeing Elsa read in the camp library, started a book club and invited Elsa to join, creating a space where she could connect with other women in the community. The minister who had married them preached a sermon about forgiveness and reconciliation that changed some hearts, if not all. And slowly, very slowly, Elsa became part of the community. She learned to can vegetables and bake bread. She joined the church choir and sang hymns in accented English. She helped at the school fundraisers and the county fair. She became known not as the German woman or the former POW, but as Elsa Mitchell, Tom's wife, a quiet woman with sad eyes who worked hard and treated everyone with courtesy. In 1950, their first child was born, a daughter they named Margaret after Thomas's mother. The birth of the baby seemed to soften even more hearts in the community. It was hard to maintain anger and suspicion toward a young mother with a newborn. Hard to see her as an enemy when she was so clearly just a woman trying to raise her child and build a life. 2 more children followed, a son in 1952 and another daughter in 1954. Thomas and Elsa raised their children to be proud of both their German and American heritage, to understand that their existence was proof that love could overcome even the deepest divisions, that families could be built across the ruins of war. Elsa never forgot where she came from or what she had survived. She corresponded regularly with her mother in Berlin until her mother's death in 1962. She followed news from Germany closely, watching her homeland slowly rebuild and transform into a democracy. She felt complicated emotions about Germany, grief for what had been lost, shame for what had been done, hope for what might be possible. But America had become her home in a way she never expected. Not because she had abandoned her German identity, but because she had learned that home is not just about where you are from. It is about where you are loved, where you are accepted, where you can build a future. And Thomas had given her that, had fought for her right to have that, had stood beside her through years of difficulty and judgment to create a life together. They stayed married for 58 years. Thomas died in 2004 at the age of 85, still living in the same farmhouse they had bought in 1946, still surrounded by the fields he had worked his entire life. Elsa held his hand as he passed. This man who had carried her through the rain, who had declared his love for her when it was impossible, who had spent nearly 6 decades proving every single day that he had meant it. Elsa lived another 7 years without him, passing away in 2011 at the age of 90. She was buried beside Thomas in the town cemetery, under a simple stone that bore both their names and a single inscription, "Love conquers all." Their story became something of a legend in their community. The initial hostility and suspicion had long since faded, replaced by respect and even pride in the couple who had defied expectations and built a remarkable life together. Their children and grandchildren told the story to anyone who would listen, a story about 2 people from opposite sides of history's most terrible war, who had found each other and chosen love over hatred. At Elsa's funeral, Her oldest daughter, Margaret, spoke about her mother's courage. She talked about how Elsa had never hidden her German heritage, but had never used it as an excuse either. She talked about how her mother had taught her children that identity was complex, that people were more than their nationalities or their pasts, that everyone deserved the chance to grow and change and become better than they were. But perhaps the most powerful tribute came from the town mayor, whose own father had been one of the harshest critics of Thomas and Elsa's marriage back in 1946. He stood at the funeral and acknowledged his father's prejudice, then talked about how Elsa had slowly, patiently, through decades of quiet dignity and hard work, had proven that former enemies could become neighbors, friends, family. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, taught this town something we needed to learn. She taught us that forgiveness is not just about forgetting the past. It is about believing that people are capable of being more than the worst things their countries did. She came here as a former prisoner, as someone we had every reason to hate. But she became one of us through the simple, persistent, revolutionary act of being a good neighbor, a good friend, a good person. Years later, when historians and journalists would ask Elsa's children about their parents' famous love story, about how a German POW and her American guard fell in love and built a life together, they always emphasized the same point. It was not easy, they would say. It was never easy. Their parents faced years of hostility, judgment, and prejudice. There were times when it would have been simpler to give up, to let society's disapproval crush their relationship. But their father had carried their mother through the rain when she fell, and he never stopped carrying her through the storms they faced together. And their mother had chosen to trust an enemy soldier with her heart, and she never regretted that leap of faith. They had loved each other through everything, had built a family and a life that proved love was stronger than war, that individuals could refuse to let history define their futures. Their story remains a testament to the idea that even in humanity's darkest hours, love can still bloom, that walls built by governments and armies cannot stop hearts from recognizing kindness, from reaching across divides, from choosing connection over division. Thomas and Elsa Mitchell proved that the enemy is a lie we tell ourselves, that underneath the uniforms and nationalities are just people capable of extraordinary love if they are brave enough to reach for it. In the end, their love story was not remarkable because it was easy or simple or universally celebrated. It was remarkable because they chose it anyway, because Thomas saw a woman reading Wuthering Heights under a tree and recognized a kindred spirit instead of an enemy, because Elsa accepted a cup of hot cocoa and a kind word and allowed herself to believe that not all Americans were monsters, because two people decided that love mattered more than the categories war tried to force them into. As their grandson said at a family reunion celebrating what would have been their 75th wedding anniversary, "My grandfather once told me that the moment he knew he loved my grandmother was not some grand gesture or dramatic moment. It was watching her read a book and realizing that she saw the world the way he did, that she asked the same questions, that she carried the same hopes for something better than the hatred surrounding them. Love," he said, "is not about ignoring our differences. It is about deciding that our shared humanity matters more." That is the legacy of the German POW who fell in love with her American guard. Not just a love story, but a reminder that we are all capable of seeing past our programming, past our prejudices, past the walls that history builds between us. All it takes is the courage to reach across the divide, to risk rejection and judgment, to believe that on the other side of hatred there might be something worth fighting for even harder than we fought in war. Love, connection, the possibility of home.